And you guys mentioned something that there's not a lot of research out there on emergent language or working with it. So what research is out there on emergent language? I think you mentioned something, Danny, about Rod Ellis. I think he wrote a paper on focus and form a while ago.
That's right. Yeah.
He supports this idea, and
and correction he's written on as well in a lot of detail.
So people like Long and Ellis are giving kind of theoretical underpinnings for sort of how you might work with it. We had to draw a lot on literature about corrective feedback because that's where there is a big body of work, but it tends to be about should it be explicit or not explicit. Do recasts work, or is it better to do it immediately or delayed? So you've kind of got this niche that's not quite what we're saying, because we're also talking about saying, oh, another way you could do that is
that doesn't really pop up, does it?
That bit, so we drew on Walsh as well. So Walsh is
classroom interactional competence framework. A lot of stuff from Walsh actually. And I mean, there's some interesting things that we found. We looked into sort of researching to focus on form. There was a really interesting paper, is it 2018, by two Iranian scholars called Golemi and Golemi. And they found out something really rather obvious, but it's nice to hear it, which is basically there's a lot of student uptake when students ask questions on focus on form moments. But we find the term focus on form is quite a confusing term, and we've decided, as you're laughing, and I think it's not very teacher friendly. So we think emergent language sounds, the metaphor of it sounds a lot more palatable to teachers as well.
I think there will be people who read it saying, oh, you're just talking about focus on form, and it's like, but we're giving it a better name.
And depends on which.
But they're not the audience. They're not the audience. Okay. Wow. I want to talk about Van Leer, because I remember when I had a conversation with Scott, we talked a lot about Van Leer. I don't think we should, because I don't know. I find his writing very difficult to.
Yes, I'm the same.
Are you the same?
The semiotics and
the ecology and all that. Yeah, it's really difficult to understand. So we'll save that for another time.
Several times that one.
But I think that's where we've been a good team, because you're a fast reader.
Do you think? I don't know.
The dread for me would be when I get a text from Richard and it'd be sort of like, I've written 1,000 words. And I'm like, oh my God.
What's in those 1,000 words?
And it's like Van Leer, because you will get it and synthesize it. And I'm kind of like, hold on, so what? So he's saying what? I really read slowly and question it. So I think you were quite good at you'd explain to me what he meant. It's like, let's say it like this then.
Because I don't think he ever used the word emergent language, but he used the term emergent a lot. He used the words emergent.
He does use the term emergent language.
He does.
In the chapter on affordances and emergence.
Right, affordances, yes, that's the one.
I can see the page. And that's because that's when I got excited when I found that, because it was like, right, okay, we're working with something. And it very much talks about, things like that were around at the time, so like chaos theory and other ideas that feed into this, and the kind of what is the nature of learning itself, and the metaphor of emergence. I think, as I think Scott said at some point, that we're using emergent language in a different sense to the term of emergence in psychology and language learning, but it's certainly got something to do with it. In terms of emergent grammar or Joan Bybee's stuff on the emergent lexicon, I think these ideas do feed into the concept of working with what comes up in the classroom as a result.
And you both said that it can be quite difficult for people to actually work with emergent language. Again, as you said, it's a very difficult skill to master, specifically for new teachers, specifically teachers in pre-service courses. So how do you think new teachers can actually start working with emergent language? What would be the starting point for people who want to move away from a more prescriptive type of teaching and work with a more reactive form of teaching?
Little changes to certain activities. So, I mean, you might just say to someone, extend your lead-in. If you're going to do a brainstorming activity, brainstorm 10 words, but make sure that they're exactly what the learners want to say. How would they say it? If they're doing a reading, maybe get rid of the detailed reading task and so let's say you gave them a restaurant review. Say, get rid of what kind of restaurant is it? How many dishes have meat in them? What's the most expensive dish? No, would you eat here?
Why?
And why?
Yeah.
Just let them talk about that. So they're doing exactly what sort of maybe the course book is suggesting, but they're just giving themselves opportunities to listen to what the students are saying.
And it's a more authentic response to a text, to often even the display text that you have in course books. But that certainly opens up space, doesn't it?
And we've suggested as well that if you can, get your phone out and listen and record the students doing that.
Right.
And then go home and think, okay, what could I have helped them with? We're training them to listen first, react much later. Because I think, I've only stopped doing this very recently. This thing about walk around in CELTA with a pad noting down the errors, and it's kind of like, that's really hard thing to do, because you're noting down the errors and thinking, why is that wrong? And now you're not listening anymore. You're just looking at a sentence, thinking, what am I going to do with this? And then and that's it.
And I think that the key thing, one of the activities that we'll talk about in the webinar as well is basically just noting down what the students are talking about. So the feedback on content has to come first, because it's that creating that meaning focus that then possibly allows space for to work on language. We're saying things to trainees like, well, just try putting one thing on the board. As it's going along. Just try one thing. Don't try and put everything on there. Don't listen for everything. And the more confident you get, obviously, you start working with it in open class. Now, I've got to say, I don't get in the classroom as much as I'd like to at the moment. But I did cover a week of classes a couple of weeks ago, and I wasn't. It's pandemic and everything online. You can hear everything on Zoom really clearly in a breakout room and make your notes, discreetly and whatever. And confronted with a room of 15 very noisy intermediate international students, I was really struggling to hear what they were saying. So I think with the experience, then you're able to deal with emergent language much more in open class feedback as well. But it is about building up that confidence to do that.
Right.
But it's the listening first, as we talked about before.
So I think that the rationale for the book is kind of, this will speed up the process. We think it won't. It's still going to take time.
It's really a support book, isn't it?
I'd say so. I think also watching other teachers as well.
How would you talking to colleagues as well about it?
Okay. How would you suggest, and I'm linking back to the class is an hour or whatever and the class is over, how does, or if emergent language can apply to lots of things happen now asynchronously when the teacher is not there, tasks to do at home, homework, or just do this before our next class kind of thing. How can we encourage students to recognize their own quote unquote emergent language as they're practicing outside of class?
Or even gaps, right, Andrew? Or even gaps.
Yeah. And there's some interesting tools, aren't there, that you can use. There's something called Flipgrid, if you come across that. I haven't used it extensively, but I've used it once with students. It's really nice that they send you the little videos that they've rehearsed or they've had to go out once and sent to you. And I think that kind of thing can give you some data to work with as well.
I think even something as simple as take photos of things. Always like this. We'd done a lesson we'd done a lesson with quite low levels on superlatives, and I'd been saying, superlatives not just because it's the number one thing. You're often selling something, and so you're go and see if you could go out and find some examples. A student came back a couple of days later and he showed me his phone, and he'd taken 3 pictures of posters for musicals. And he'd said, a lot of best musicals in London.
That's great, isn't it?
And he said that, it's not one, is it? There's lots of them, and they're advertising. So he's seeing it all the time. And so you can kind of get them to sort of notice what they've learned. Go and find this now, see for yourself.
I think there's a good bit of learner training that you can do in the classroom as well. And you remember those old things you used to get in like, I don't know, what books were they? Like Cutting Edge, and there'd be a book on how to keep a vocabulary notebook.
Right.
Taking that idea, but actually looking at what happens on the board and what you put down in your diaries. In this class I was teaching recently, and it's the most recent one I can remember, we spent a bit of time, actually talking about, okay, what's on the board? Why am I highlighting this? What should you write down in your book? How can you practice it when you go home? And then the next day, not just letting it just drift away, but then maybe looking at your notes, looking at your picture of your board, and then picking out what do you think are the most useful, which phrases have got the highest surrender value that you think the learners will find useful in the future. And then going back and and letting that resurge in the next lesson, you know, to emergent resurgence, which my friend, I've nicked it off Katie Kelly, a colleague of ours.
It's funny you say that, because
emergence resurgence, you said. I like that.
I have an interesting question to ask you, because I've recently started learning Turkish, and my teacher is not really good, because he's basically teaching me a lot of Turkish grammar, and I said, I don't want to learn the grammar. I want to be able to communicate with you. But the teacher's like, oh, but you don't know any Turkish. I said, I know a few phrases. I know a few things. So my question to you is, can you work with emergent language when you are basically teaching a class with beginners, lower levels, or even, I don't know, a lot of teachers say, oh, but I work with teenagers. I work with like young learners. Is emergent language possible within those scenarios and these contexts?
So there's two things there. So
lower levels for sure.
So lower levels for sure. I think it's all emergent at lower levels, actually. You know,
exactly.
That's
what I told her. Yeah.
And I remember when I went to Costa Rica. Were you in Quepos when you were in Costa Rica? Did you ever go there? It's like
beautiful,
National Park. Beautiful.
Oh,
and the language school was on a balcony looking out onto the rainforest, and there was like, you know, iguanas and things and huge, incredible birds, and it's wonderful. Terrible. And we sat outside. It's brilliant.
Sorry, you had to go through that.
I know, it's awful, really awful. Well, and what was great about it, and I was still doing my PPP lessons and on the project when I was showing other people what I'd learned on my initial teacher training qualification, PPP, and I hadn't picked up on what the teacher was actually doing. There were conversation-driven lessons, and the teacher, one day, the other student, she was a really bright Swiss girl who was better than me, and I found her quite annoying because I couldn't quite keep up with the conversation, and she wasn't there one day, and I had a brilliant conversation one-to-one with the teacher, who was just fantastic. And I wanted to talk about politics. I didn't want to talk about, you know, the story, the fairy tale that was in the course book that they created, because that was, you know, really not stimulating for me at all. So we talked about politics, about Costa Rica with my pre-intermediate Spanish at a pretty low level. And she just basically reformulated and stopped and looked at pieces of language and grammar that came up as and when it, and that was much more memorable to me, because I was writing that down in my notebook. We often call these the notebook moments in a class, where you notice the students all write something down because it's new and it's interesting for them. And it's back to that point about, you know, that Danny mentioned, that Rod Ellis says there's more chance of that sticking if there's that kind of investment in it, or interest in it.
It's incidental as opposed to intentional.
Exactly.
Your question, though, I think, is with lower levels, is if we could strip the grammar out of low-level syllabuses, I think there'd be so much more progress, because it is all about lexis.
Reach out for the grammar.
Every time a student says, "Teacher, what this?" You're like, "Oh, what's this?" You give them the word, and then you write, "Okay, here's the question. What's this? How do I say this?" So you notice two things: they don't know what the word means, but they don't know how to ask what the word means.
Exactly.
And so, you know, that's two things they've learned straight away, and that just has to happen all the time.
And it just lends
lexical syllabus,
absolutely,
really.
and it lends itself just to quite natural practice of it,
right?
Bounce it straight back to the students. I think that's the thing with emergent language. It's not only just putting things on the board and leaving it there. It is about what you do with it afterwards, and working with it, not just recycling it, but giving them a chance of practicing some articulation with it, doing a little bit of memory work with it, you know, coming back after the break and rubbing out half of the collocations or the chunks you've got on the board, and then seeing if the students can remember it. So
I think Willis does a lot of work with that.
Yeah.
At different contexts, right? Like instead of just flipping the page in the book and moving on to the next thing, like what's this is for a low level, like a perfect question. Like we talked to Chris Jacobs before about Flo, who does a lot of work with Flo, and he gave this task for low. Like he teaches French, A1 French, and he said, okay, back to school. So we're going back to school shopping, and we're going to do back to school for clothes, but clothes for different occasions. So on Monday we do back to school shopping for clothes for school, and then the next day is clothes for going out, and the next day is clothes for, so you get to recycle and all of the phrases, but you slightly change the context, which means a little bit a little differentiation. Instead of moving on dramatically, you equip the student with these phrases that are applicable to all these different contexts, adding, you know, in task-based learning, a little bit of complexity, a little bit of difference, what they actually have to do, but largely it's the same thing.
We've got this lovely script in this book that came from a recording by a teacher called Richard Gallan, who teaches ESOL, mostly migrant, a lot of Bangladeshi learners. And I mean, in a way, you could look at it and think, okay, so you've taken about 5 minutes to teach the difference between refund and exchange, but it's all come from the learners. And it's just a dialogue about what happens when you go to the market and you want to get your money back and they say no, and they're asking for guidance on what you actually do at the market, but Richard's just feeding in all these expressions like, oh, you mean get your money back? Oh no, that's exchanges, change the color. He's just upgrading all the time.
I like that.